Hello and welcome to Reader 2 Standing By, Episode 9. I'm Wedge.
And I'm Wraith14.
And we are so happy to have you join us in our journey through the X-Wing series of Star Wars stories from the old expanded universe. This episode, we're talking about the 7th book in the X-Wing novel series, and the 3rd and final book of the Wraith Squadron Trilogy, Solo Command, by Aaron Allston. Spoiler alert, we will spoil all 7 books and the comics we've covered so far. So, please, if you don't want to be spoiled, go ahead and read those books because they're awesome. Let's give a little context for this month's book, both in and out of universe. So, out of universe, Solo Command was released in February of 1999, about 7 months after Iron Fist in July of 1998, and just 2 months before Isard's Revenge came out in April. I want to just focus on the short slice of time between Iron Fist and Isard's Revenge, because otherwise when we talk about Isard's Revenge, it'll be very duplicating. So just between that, we had 2 months of February and March, and then, of course, April. I do want to mention one thing that happened in May afterwards, because it does sort of impact. I think it's something we don't talk about as much when we talk about the impact of the later X-Wing books. So in February 1999, X-Wing Alliance, the PC 4th game in the X-Wing Flight Simulator series, was released. It doesn't quite have the same nostalgia as the first X-Wing and TIE Fighter games because it was a much more crowded video game landscape. But when it released on Good Old Games, probably about a decade ago, I found it to be the most modern and fun to replay. And I think all of the games have gotten either fan or official upgrades, so graphical upgrades and gameplay upgrades. But X-Wing Alliance just had the most to work with from the original 4 games.
Yeah, I just got a new PC and was playing the remastered mod of X-Wing Alliance for a little bit to test it out. And considering how new the PC is and how old the game is, it works pretty well with that mod anyway.
Pretty nifty. Definitely, I would recommend getting it on Steam or Good Old Games. It's a very fun game. You do need a flight stick to fly it, but those are usually only about $20, so it's not too bad if you've got a decent access to the monies. The X-Wing The X-Wing Rogue Squadron comic series had completed 3 months before Solo Command came out in November of 1998. But the X-Wing Rogue Squadron comic collections, or trade paperbacks, were still being released and would be released for a couple years after the actual issues released. So in February of 1999, Requiem for a Rogue was released. So that was kind of a funny thing. It was about 2 years old, and we already had the whole question of Baron Fell kind of resolved in his time in Rogue Squadron, and then the Wraith books had this completely strange and mysterious appearance of Baron Fell working for Warlord Zinj. So we'll definitely be talking about that a lot in this episode because that mystery is, of course, resolved in Solo Command. 3 months after Solo Command came out, The Phantom Menace was released in May. There were already comics and some novels being published to market and lead into The Phantom Menace, which started the multi-era approach. So previously, we'd had a couple of multi-era things. So you had things like the Tales of the Jedi comics, which were 20 to 4,000 years before A New Hope, and you also had, of course, the whole Thrawn trilogy, Jedi Academy trilogy, that whole sequence in the aftermath of Return of the Jedi. So that's technically 2 periods, but you didn't really have novels being published in the Tales of the Jedi thing. So the novels were all concentrated in this 20 years after A New Hope time frame. The release of The Phantom Menace meant that you started having a lot more books actually being published at that time. So that kind of split the focus of publishing and of readers. And I think that's something that's not discussed enough when we talk about why the X-Wing books, particularly the Wraith Squadron, books, didn't have as much of an impact as the Rogue Squadron books, because the Rogue Squadron books started coming out in 1996, so they had several more years to be integrated into role-playing game materials and referenced in novels like Spectre of the Past by Timothy Zahn. But no one really wrote books that referenced the Wraith Squadron books, because you either were reading the New Jedi Order, or you were reading the prequel era. And obviously the prequel era is not going to reference the Wraith Squadron, which happens 30 years later.
Well, you will find out if you go deep into, I think it's like an Essential Reader's Companion thing, that the mother of one of the A-Wing pilots pops up in Attack of the Clones. Somebody retconned that in, but substantively, you're correct.
Yeah, and of course you've got some hyperspace articles for the Star Wars. I want to say it's the Star Wars Insider magazine, which referenced Vin Narcasten, of course, who is father of Shala, as we find out in this book. But there just wasn't any new stories about Face or Min or Lara or Kel or Piggy or Tyria, until, of course, we get to Aaron Allston's books in the New Jedi Order. But, of course, that's an episode for a later time. But I think that the split focus, both into the New Jedi Order, which was kind of a soft reboot of the Star Wars timeline. It wasn't a continuity reboot, but it was a fresh start designed to be a new jumping on point for new readers, so they didn't have to read the 20 to 30 books that had already been published. They could just start with Vector Prime, and this is where you're reading. And, of course, people reading the prequel era. So just not a lot of room for the Wraith Squadron books to be referenced, which is a great shame because they're awesome and more people should reference them. Speaking of references, in universe, we have 3 main pieces that are connected to Solo Command. It is a direct prequel, probably less than a day, possibly less than an hour, takes place between the end of Solo Command and the beginning of David Wolverton's Courtship of Princess Leia, released in 1994, 5 years before this book was published. Allston drew a lot of details provided by Wolverton in the book and fleshed it out into this gripping novel. Wolverton talks about how this was a 5-month campaign against Warlord Zinj. He named the Mon Ramanda and Captain Onuma, the Mon Calamari captain. He names Leia's flagship, the Imperial Star Destroyer Rebel Dream. He talks about Zinj's retreat to the planet of Dathomir. He posits the idea of warlords being a roughly equal third party versus the New Republic and the Imperial Remnant. Although, weirdly, Wolverton seems to imply that the Empire is gone, even though the Thrawn trilogy, Dark Empire, and the Jedi Academy trilogy had already been published, showing that there was definitely people claiming the title of Empire without being part of the Warlord movement. So this is a problem with the mid-90s books. They didn't really have someone thinking through how the Empire actually progressed and descended, the descent of the Empire. Wolverton also talked about Selagus, a colony that Zinj turned into rubble with the Iron Fist. Talked about Solo following the Iron Fist and finding huge swaths of destruction in its wake. He talked about how the Iron Fist was believed to be destroyed, but of course it wasn't really. The Raptors, Zinj's secret police and enforcers, the Nightcloak technology, General Melvar as a sadistic, metal-fingernailed monster, also being young, although that's not really something Allston talked about. He, of course, coined the somewhat insulting line, "Kiss my Wookiee," because Chewbacca is his own person. He's not Han's Wookiee. He talked about Zinj cursing in 60 languages after Solo defeated him. And, of course, he provided the description of Zinj as a pudgy man with a large gray mustache, although Allston, again, didn't really talk about the color of the mustache. Wolverton didn't mention Wedge or even Rogue Squadron, despite having his book be just a year before the Thrawn trilogy, in which Han and Wedge are friendly and doing missions together at the beginning. So that was a bit odd. I guess it would make sense for there to be plenty of squadrons, and of course there are over a dozen New Republic squadrons named in Solo Command. But it would make sense for Han to be working with Wedge, since he had worked with Wedge before several times. So it's a bit odd that Wolverton didn't include even a mention of Rogue Squadron with the task force.
Probably for the best, since that gave Allston more room to work. And now's a good time to mention I have not read Courtship of Princess Leia. So that's why Lantio is going over all the details, because I didn't know a lot of that was actually from Courtship originally.
Yeah, Allston clearly read Courtship very carefully and took the pieces and just formed it into a novel. And as we see from the next piece, he also read Kraken's Threat Dossier. Now, I do want to mention the previous Rogue Squadron podcast that I'm aware of, Rogue Pontran. All hats off to them for starting us off on the X-Wing themed podcasts. They chose to read Courtship of Princess Leia after finishing Solo Command. We will not be doing that, because I think that Courtship of Princess Leia is not a good book. It's not enjoyable. I don't expect anyone to read it. I didn't read it till about 15 years after I finished Solo Command in 1999. And we'll tell you what you need to know. I mean, basically, all you really need to know is Han goes to Dathomir and shoots Warlord Fist in the face with concussion missiles. The end. But we'll talk about that a bit more in the following after we summarize the book. Now, Kraken's Threat Dossier was part of the West End Games supplements. It serves as the source book for 7 books. Courtship of Princess Leia, the Black Fleet Crisis Trilogy, and the Carillion Trilogy. It was published in 1997, and all of the writers of Kraken's Threat Dossier are credited in Solo Command's acknowledgement section. So I'm pretty sure that Allston used Kraken's Threat Dossier when he was writing this book, and of course the previous 2. Kraken's Threat Dossier tells us that for 4 months the Mon Ramonda pursued Zinj, and then a big fleet clash happens when Solo finds out that Zinj has 3 times more ships than Solo's fleet. It also says that the Battle of Salagas is the end of the Zinj campaign. Now, the Battle of Levian 2 is clearly what Allston created for when Solo finds out how big Zinj's fleet is, when all 3 of Zinj's groups jump in. And of course, the Battle of Salagas is the finale of the book. Allston chooses to subvert almost everything about Melvar and Zinj in Kraken's Threat Dossier, because Kraken's Threat Dossier is written as in-universe intelligence reports compiled by NRI agents. which means that they only know what they've investigated. It's not actually written from the perspective of, say, Imperial intelligence or Zinj's security forces, which might know more. So that's why you have things like Melvar is an Imperial intelligence agent, when instead Melvar tells Zinj in Solo Command that he was never Imperial intelligence, he just familiarized himself with their tactics. We also learn in Kraken's threat dossier that Zinj was first assigned a Victory Star Destroyer called the Iron Fist, and when he was awarded a Super Star Destroyer called the Brawl sometime around The Empire Strikes Back, he renamed it Iron Fist after that Victory Star Destroyer, which of course is mentioned in a significant way in Solo Command. We also have some art of the TIE Raptor and the specs, giving it the maneuverability and the concussion missile launchers we see in Solo Command. The third piece, after Courtship and Kraken's threat dossier, is Tatooine Ghost. Now, Wraith, have you read Tatooine Ghost?
I have not.
So this is definitely not necessary, but it's not nearly as bad as Courtship of Princess Leia. I have read it. It is by Troy Denny. It takes place about 8 months after Courtship of Princess Leia and about 9 months before, and I say, well, it's 9 months before Last Command. So it's very soon before Heir to the Empire. I say 9 months because I believe Troy Denning has said this is when Jaina and Jason were conceived on Han and Leia's honeymoon, where they go to Tatooine.
Of course they would go to Tatooine.
It's Denning, okay? This is the one Troy Denning book that I would consider owning, though. Denning actually mentions Wraith Squadron quite a bit. He doesn't mention any specific pilots, but he does talk about Wedge and the Wraiths going on a mission to kidnap a Grand Moff, and how Han and Leia's personal mission puts that mission in jeopardy. It gets kind of messy. It doesn't really resolve. They don't say whether or not the Wraith mission succeeds, but it is cool to have Han and Leia connected to Wraith Squadron right after the Wraith books. So that is some really nice continuity by Denning between Solo Command, Courtship of Princess Leia, and Tatooine Ghost. We also have, because it's on Tatooine, Leia meets the Darklighters, including Gavin's father, and he talks about how Gavin served on the Zinj campaign. So that's a really nice piece of continuity too, between the Back to War, where we see Gavin's father, and Tatooine Ghost. So I would honestly recommend Tatooine Ghost if you want to find Han and Leia story. It is not in any way an X-Wing novel, so we won't be doing it for the podcast, unlike a lot of the other books that we're going to be doing, which I consider X-Wing novels, but don't have the X-Wing branding. But it's worth reading. Unlike Courtship, in my opinion. I know a lot of people do like Courtship. I'm not one of them. We won't be reading it for the book, for the podcast, and I don't personally recommend it. But if you like it, this is not me saying you can't or you shouldn't, obviously. Just my personal opinion. With all that context, let's get to our mission report. So, our story starts with a Twi'lek officer in the New Republic named Jart Ayan, who attacks Admiral Akbar out of nowhere. Akbar was having a mission briefing with Wraith Squadron pilot Piggy, and Piggy, even though he gets shot in the stomach by Ayan, manages to save the day because of his more violent Gamorrean warrior instincts, and he punches the dude's head straight through a wall. Face and Lara test a new fighter tactic versus Wedge and Tycho in the simulators, and then they all head to a briefing where Face is promoted to provisional or brevet captain of Wraith Squadron and becomes Wraith leader, Wedge resumes direct command of the rogues, and they get one additional pilot, a lesser Targan, a Deveronian, who is very superstitious and believes in good and bad luck, and also is very silly and obnoxious sometimes, but I like him. Before they join the Mon Ramonda in the direct search for Zinj, the race have one last day of leave on Coruscant, where Min learns about Vin Narcassin, who is Shala's father and was a Old Republic intelligence officer, and he found out that in the Old Republic intelligence display in the museum, and it's kind of funny because this is an update of the intelligence and this history museum that Corrin and Wedge went to see in Wedge's Gamble.
Yes, they've updated it now that the New Republic is running things and is offering a more neutral view. At one point, I think it's even mentioned that the Imperial Intelligence section isn't even described as badly as it could be.
Well, you don't have like Leia Organa talking about how new Imperial Intelligence was just made up of people who hide under your bed and say boo. It does, however, show, Imperial Intelligence agents torturing people to death for fictitious crimes. So
Speaking of fictitious crimes,
it's still very dark. Now, while they're at the museum, they bump into an Old Republic intelligence officer who got shot on a mission just after the transition to the Empire, who seems to think that Lara is a woman named Adalia Monothere, which leads to a bunch of jokes that Wraith and I love to say when someone says a goofy name, like Gurwa Patunkan.
Yes, I'm searching for that section now. Basically, Face rattles off a list of other names that he thinks Lara may have used. Gurwa Patunkan, Titovia Lamprey, Diplogone Freet, and Maplugi Starko.
To which Lara responds that she's going to shoot Face.
In which need to be heard on the audiobook, if you can get that.
Oh, yes. I forgot. I need to add the audiobook section.
So that takes us right into the action with the Battle of Levian 2, where Mon Ramonda has been called in to try and help a world attacked by Zinj's forces, but it's a trap to determine when the New Republic would show up, and once they do, they bring in Zinj's whole fleet, which is surprisingly larger than Solo's fleet, at least in terms of what the New Republic thought he had. And so they barely get out of there through some clever tactics, which notably results in having to leave Levian 2 behind under attack by Zinj, which would have probably been even more demoralizing. So yeah, there's a whole lot of battle action, but the gist is they get out narrowly. Wedge is thinking about, am I going to have to fight Baron Fel? And kind of updating the reader on why Wedge is so concerned about Fel in terms of that's the one person who knows where my sister might be.
And I love how Allston sort of introduces fleet jargon like keeping them honest, which is having starfighters attack the top of a ship while a capital ship shoots the bottom, so that they have to divide their shields instead of being able to concentrate all their energy on the side the capital ship is. And they use that throughout the whole book, but they introduce it and then they reinforce it by having it do having it occur in different situations. So I really love how Allston just thinks of these tactics and these terms that you would use if you were a pilot or a commander, and then seeds them in with explanations, and it just makes the space combat make so much sense. Next, Solo and Zinj go into planning mode because they've just had huge intelligence updates from the Battle of Levian 2 in the pilot's lounge on Mon Ramonda. The Wraiths, Rogues, and Polearms, those are all the pilots that we know are there.
Well, we know one polearm is there. We don't know about the rest.
Given the fact that they tend not to have group commander level officers or higher spend a lot of time, probably not Toad Germain, but there's a good chance that Tentaku Noor was there. Han talks to Wedge about rumors of a Twi'lek conspiracy because of a couple other attacks, in addition to the Jart-Ayan attack that opened the book. Meanwhile, Zinj investigates his alien experiments on Salagas in the Binrin biomedical complex, and we meet the sinister Dr. Etta Gast, the daughter of the original project supervisor. And we also get information about how that man killed most of his test subjects who had been through the aggression cycle, but Piggy, who had not been through the aggression cycle, he helped to escape and faked his death. So a bit more backstory on Piggy. Dr. Gast is put in charge of the Binring project and told to bring it onto Iron Fist after Wraith Squadron comes looking for them, and she kills them.
Yes, that chapter also mentions that Zinj, after he was going to decide what to do with these two doctors, had a massage scheduled, which is just such a bizarre detail. It cracks me up. So yes, that takes us to chapter 4, where we get inside Lyra's head for a bit to update the reader on everything going on inside Lyra's head. So Wedge is giving the briefing about their mission to Safalor and how the rogues will have to play babysitter, much to the dismay of Gavin Darklighter. Ironic, since he's the youngest of the rogues. Meanwhile, Piggy is getting out of Bacta and is able to rejoin, which is good because Safalor is the biomedical place where he was raised. We also get some details on Min's backstory and how he's improved mentally and now is thinking about the future and Laranato specifically. Then when they're down on the ground on Safalor, Min asks Lyra out in a rather typical pilot, cocky ego fashion. There's a kiss, and then he makes the mistake of saying that's more like it, and she reminds him that was not a good idea. But he thinks, well, as far as things usually go for me, that wasn't so bad.
It is such a hopeless disaster of a person.
And which that was also something they were talking about before the kiss, is like, my life's a wreck, so is mine.
On Safalor, we start with the race holding up a local businessman and stealing his speeder. Then they run surveillance on the Binring complex and figure out where the medical testing facility is and how to get in. That night, they break in using a cool zipline device from Shala. We also find out that Tyria's force abilities have been improving. She's able to put herself into a flow state where she can feel reactions from the force, which is much stronger than she'd ever been able to do in the previous 2 books. When they get into the base, they find that a lot of extra security has been put in, and they find a lot of mysterious things that Piggy doesn't remember from growing up. And we're assuming he only escaped maybe a year or 2 before, so it's not that long ago. And since Piggy has an extremely strong memory and strong intellect, he probably remembers it quite well. And so they get into a strange room, and immediately the floors are a trapdoor, and they fall into a new room. And we do have a comment about that, but that's going to come later. So don't spoil our comment about that yet.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of things we will pick up on from these initial details later. So the Wraiths are being held at blaster point by the stormtroopers standing around the edge of the trapdoor. and they tell the Wraiths to give up their explosives, which Face agrees to. He tells Kel, yeah, give it up. But then Kel turns and directs that toward Shala. And when Face is asking, why do you hide who has the explosives, they're going to figure it out in 30 seconds. Kel points out this is an incinerator, and we're supposed to be dead within 30 seconds, too. So they use the explosives that they still have instead of the containers of food that Shala gave up to blast their way out of the incinerator, though several of them suffer some pretty horrific burn injuries and manage to make their way through most of the stormtroopers. They capture Gast and kill Netbers, who had been introduced in Iron Fist as the hand-to-hand combat expert that worked for Zinj and had met Shala in her disguise as one of the Hawkbat pirates. So they go after him to kill him when Shala sees that Netbers recognizes her as being one of the Hawkbats. And Shala wants to keep that secret. She tries to fight him first, and given her burns, it ends badly for her. But then Runt just picks Netbers up by the arm and starts slamming him into a bulkhead until his neck snaps, which we see from Netbers' point of view until it cuts off. Meanwhile, Lara and Min and Elasar are up on the rooftops, Min providing sniper cover, while Elasar and Lara are finding out this is more of a trap. They initially had tried to warn the other Wraiths. Then they get in a shootout with stormtroopers on account of their comm signal being detected. And the rogues come in to save the day when Min, Lara, and Elasar had essentially been captured and they dropped their weapons. So back on the ground, Face gives the order for the Wraiths to make their way out of the remaining compound and not show any mercy, which none of them were too keen on doing anyway.
Try to burn someone alive and you're surprised when they're mad at you? So when they get back to the Mon Ramonda, Wedge talks to Face, and Face has a pretty good reaction in that everyone survived, even though it went very dangerously. They got the intel they wanted from Dr. Gast. So it's cool to see how Face has matured as a leader and as a pilot. Lara agrees to go out with Min, and then the task force goes to Jussafat, which is actually an Imperial world which has been attacked by Zinj. While they're doing this, Mon Mothma on Coruscant is attacked by her Gotal bodyguard in a very similar scene to Admiral Akbar being attacked by his Twi'lek adjutant. Wedge and Han at Jussafat are both attacked by two Twi'lek pilots. Nuro Tuwalin of Polarn Squadron in an A-Wing fires a concussion missile at the Mon Ramonda's bridge, and Han is saved by Chewie, who at the door pulls him out of the vacuum. Wedge is shot in the back by Taldira, who was introduced in the Krytos Trap and joined Rogue Squadron in Back to War. And Tyria Sarkin is forced to kill Nura Dwalin, and Corran Horn is forced to kill Taldira.
They both get a bit of an assist from the Force in the process of that, where Tyria is able to distinguish where Nuro is based on his ships in relation to Mon Ramonda, and she just innately senses that he's faking his engine failure that's forced him to go back, because without even realizing it, Tyria has drifted out of formation to follow Nuro. And on Corran's part, he got a flash of warning right before Taudira opened fire on Wedge, and Wedge breaks away immediately. So the worst of Taudira's shooting misses.
Yeah, and the two Twi'leks we now know are part of a Zinj plot because they're activated by a man named Gailey, who's one of the cafeteria workers on the Mon Ramonda, who's been bribed by a Warlord Zinj operative. So we now know that the Twi'leks are part of a Zinj plot and seem to be some kind of brainwashing. Dr. Gast has been killed by Gailey, but Navarra Van is able to kill Gailey himself.
Yeah, that takes us to an Imperial ship showing up in the Jusafet system, since this was an Imperial world, and they'd gotten some private thank yous, even if most of them were saying, the New Republic's bad. And we get Admiral Terran Rogris, the Imperial officer tasked with going after Zin, similarly to Han, who is proposing an informal, off-the-books alliance between the New Republic and the Empire to share intelligence about Zinj's operations to their mutual benefit. Han and Wedge, meanwhile, have to ground all Twi'lek officers on account of this attack, and there's rumors that Godel officers may be next, which Wedge correctly identifies as being what Zinj was after, in a way that makes Navarra Van concerned about his sanity. And then we get the introduction in similar fashion of two described as nightmare ships. The Millennium Falsehood, a rusty YT 1300 that'll be an imitation of the actual Millennium Falcon, and the Second Death, which was a cobbled together collection of the pieces of Razor's Kiss, the Super Star Destroyer destroyed in Iron Fist, and which has Iron Fist painted on it to appear to be that Super Star Destroyer. There's also some Nightcloak technology, which I do know comes from Courtship of Princess Leia. Wedge, in an attempt to raise morale, kicks off a mutiny of anonymity aboard Mon Ramonda, which is a very fun section that we could both go on and on about, so we'll save that for later.
After the mutiny and everyone's hangovers are worn off, they head to Kidrif. In the first test of the Millennium Falsehood, pretending to be Han Solo, Wedge flies with Chewie and Squeaky, the 3PO droid and unit quartermaster for the Wraiths. Translates because Wedge doesn't speak Wookiee, much to Wes Jansen's amusement. Face gets bad news about Adalia Monothir, who turns out to be Lara's mother and married to Dal's Petithel, which makes Face realize that Lara is really Gara Petithel. Wraith put in our show notes that if he hadn't overslept, Wedge Face would have read his message in the morning, and things would have gone very differently, and possibly not as well.
Yeah, no way for Lara to escape
Exactly.
when she's already on the ground. Yeah, so okay. The details of the escape that I was mentioning there in the next chapter, which I'll talk about now. So we get the cover of the original book as opposed to the Essential Legends collection version, where you have Tycho in his X-Wing and the Millennium Falsehood flying in a city, which is always amusing to see people talking about that one before they read it, is the Falcon is doing this. And I'm like, oh, is it the Falcon now? So a whole lot happens with Kidrif where there's a big battle between New Republic and Zinj starfighters, but Face is paired up with Lara and insists they keep circling around the battle itself, not going in. And Lara is getting increasingly nervous, even more so when the battle is over and everyone is about to jump back into hyperspace. So Wedge tells Face and Lara to rejoin the group, but Face says, we need to jump in separately. I can't explain that on an open channel. And so Lara's pretty sure the game is up and she's been discovered, because there's only so many reasons why Face would do that, and it's most likely because he's protecting the rest of the squadron from her, Wedge in particular, which is ironic since her immediate thought when she was flying with the Wraiths back in Iron Fist was how easily she could shoot Wedge in the back. So then Face gets back on the comm channel with her, having finished his communication with Wedge, and she asks, you know, don't you? And Face confirms, I know you're Garrett Petithel. And then he glances back at the sensor board and realizes he is not on a one-to-one communication with Lara, but talking to the entire squadron, including Mendonos, who is out for revenge against Garrett Petithel. And is one of the most memorable parts of the book. Donos snaps, remembering what happened to Talon Squadron, flashing back to that, launches a proton torpedo at the now running away Face and Lara, where Face is using his shield to cover Lara's X-Wing. A bit of a callback to the TIE Interceptor and X-Wing ploy that Face and Lara used against Wedge and Tycho at the very beginning of the book. So Face takes the hit instead of Lara. It turns out Mendonos had detonated his torpedo just in the nick of time that Face survived, but Lara jumps away rather than surrendering, as was her initial agreement to do. So then we go back to Mon Ramonda, and man, is Wedge mad at Min. Which, again, readers will know, and I don't know how much time you want me to spend explaining that part in this chapter breakdown.
So Lara first goes to Hawkbat base from the book Iron Fist, where she plans a bunch of things and reprograms her astromech Tonin. She then jumps to Iron Fist after contacting Zinj and joins. Well, we find out from her own thoughts that her plan is to try and destroy it from the inside. Min gets advice from Wes Jansen, and the advice is typically typically Wes, very silly, but seems to do him some good. We begin the Destroy Zinj's supply chain. We begin the Destroy Zinj's supply chain mission section of the Zinj campaign with the Falsehood, Rogue, Wraith, Polearm, and Nova Squadron all working together in various permutations. And a lot of these happen off page. Lara sims against Baron Fell, doesn't meet him face to face, but flies, and thinks that it's a bummer that she keeps losing, even though she flies against the best pilots that the New Republic and Warlord Zinj have to offer. Wes learns about Cholku, the Ewok, who Wedge has procured in case they have to become the Hawkbats again to fool Zinj and need to have an actual Ewok.
And I'm convinced that backstory for Cholku, that he was found at an equivalent of like an exotic animal store on an Imperial world, is a call forward to the Vision of the Future novel, where there's an exotic animal store on Bathaway that is very significant to the plot.
Indeed.
So going ahead to chapter 12, Lyra had been meeting with one of Zinj's underlings and walking through the Super Star Destroyer, thinking about how insignificant she was and comparing herself to one of the little MSE-6, aka mouse droids, which are seen in the movies on Imperial ships and the Death Star. And then several steps after having seen the mouse droid, she realizes she can use them to destroy the Iron Fist with them from within. Meanwhile, Min has made a hover sled of sorts using all sorts of random technology he found essentially in the trash on Wes's advice to have some silly fun, and gets surprised by Wes, who had been secretly watching. And then after Min is done and has left, Wes in turn gets surprised by Wedge, who had been secretly watching for even longer, and then tells him they have to go feed Cholku since they are among the few who know about Cholku. But Cholku has seemingly escaped, and Wes is coerced into trying to find him, which inevitably results in them running into some cleansing fluid, having to cover themselves in Ewok food and nothing else. And
so they are naked.
Yes.
Let's be clear.
Wes stumbles into a room that has all the wraiths seemingly standing still. He thinks he may be dreaming. Finally finds his way out after going to several doors which would not open.
You forgot he also grabbed the stuffed Ewok on the floor.
Yeah, he's holding the Ewok, which is very important as a way to cover himself. And right as he thinks he has a way to escape by sneaking out in front of all the wraiths who are now behind him, Wedge comes in full uniform and calls them into attention, facing Wes, who then gets a Yub commander, or maybe it's Yub captain to lieutenant, which is his rank at the moment, a cloak to cover himself better. So yes, Wedge, who had previously been mocked by Wes as not being willing to get revenge, makes Wes admit that yes, he is in fact capable of doing so and has the resources. So that takes us to the preparation for yet another battle that will involve the Millennium Falsehood, with Min having volunteered for turret duty aboard the Falsehood, much as say Luke does in A New Hope when they're leaving. Where do they think Alderaan is? You can kind of see what a YT-1300's turrets look like there, because Min can't fly yet, but he points out to Wedge nothing stops him from shooting the guns, and he's pretty good at that sort of thing.
Being a sniper and all.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Fel has recruited Lyra to fly with them for this same mission.
Lyra attacks the Falsehood with her lasers from her TIE interceptor, but Squeaky realizes that similar to how Min wired his sniper rifle to carry data instead of destructive energy in Iron Fist to blow up the captured freighter that they'd planned to send. So Lyra has rewired her lasers to still look like lasers, but they're much underpowered, so they don't do as much damage, and they carry information. So she's sending a message in a way that was very hard to detect by her quote-unquote allies. They blow up Zinj's dreadnought, but Zinj himself in the Iron Fist hangs back so that Han and the Mon Ramanda can't jump in and trap him. Han and Zinj both feel like they can't beat the other, so they reach for unusual strategies. Zinj plans on a strategic retreat, and Han reaches out to the Imperials for an interdictor cruiser. They find out from Lara's message, which Min, Face, and Shala all hear, to provide analysis for Han and Wedge. And we see this from Min's perspective. So it's extremely emotional because he's fallen in love with Lara and he's still torn by his drive for revenge and his grief and guilt at Talon Squadron's destruction. So it's a very powerful scene. But Lara tells them that there are two major target worlds that she has told Zinj that Han might attack. And those are Vahamba and Selagus.
So in the next chapter, we get to see, and this is a very fun bit, the perspective of Lara's astromech Tonin, which is the much repeated phrase comes up. Tonin is an Audivian colloquialism, definition Little Aton, in reference to Aton Repnus, the corrupt New Republic officer Lara exposed back in Iron Fist. So he's thinking about his progress at reprogramming a series of the mouse droids to gather intelligence aboard Iron Fist, and how the ship's computer doesn't recognize them. There'd been a rather funny but also really tragic sequence where Lara tells Tonin that, yeah, you're probably going to get destroyed being on here, but if we pull this off, you could be the most famous astromech. Well, maybe second most after R2. Lara's own plan is deepening as she learns more about what's on Iron Fist, specifically how they've moved over all the animal or alien species.
Yeah, they're not
experimentation.
Animals, they're all sentient.
Yeah, from the bin ring facility aboard to Iron Fist itself in a section that officially does not exist.
But we saw in Castan Dawn section of Iron Fist.
Yes. I think they kind of combine existing things with what had been on bin ring earlier in this book.
Well, that's why there's so many more in this one than there were in the last book.
Meanwhile, Min has been reinstated by Wedge, and Rogris agrees after some back and forth with Face that he'll supply an interdictor. There's also reconnaissance of the Vahaba system, but not yet the full battle until the next chapter.
In Vahaba, we have a sort of mirror of the Levian 2 battle, the first battle of this book, where Mon Ramonda was trapped in a gravity well and she had to get out. But this time, because of the stellar web under Admiral Rogris's command, Zinj is trapped in a gravity well and he's desperately trying to escape because Zinj hates fighting in someone else's chosen battleground because he thinks that gives them the advantage. And to be fair, it does. Lara almost triggers her plan, but the interdictor gives her some time to add layers to her plan better. And she traps Zinj at Selagus by altering the navigational course so that Zinj goes to Selagus by himself instead of with his fleet. And then the mouse droids just rip the hyperdrive apart physically. All these little droids pulling out the wires, destroying computer chips, just sabotaging it like crazy, and there's thousands of them. Zinj calls the Hawkbats with a recorded message, and Han gets that, which proves that Zinj really is at Selagus and is trapped, which means that Shala was right to protect the Hawkbat identity by attacking Netburs. At the beginning of the novel, she was very worried that she'd endangered the squad for nothing, but in this case, it provided vital intel that Lara was telling the truth and they should attack at Selagus.
And I'll just mention that in the chapter of the audiobook, Mark Thompson makes the chief engineer of Iron Fist sound a lot like Scotty from Star Trek, the original series.
He's definitely supposed to be Scotty. It's hilarious.
But evil.
Evil
now
Scotty.
we get so now we get the part 1 of the Battle of Selagus. Zinj has managed to get a hold of reinforcements that hadn't fully left Vahaba yet, so he's not completely alone anymore and is hiding out in an asteroid belt. Han's fleet is working to find him and then pursue into the asteroid belt themselves, including the starfighters, which is risky. Lara, having sent her data message to the New Republic and thus giving away what she's really going after to Zinj, is on the run and gets to where the experimental subjects are, frees them, meets a Ewok who says he can fly a shuttlecraft to get away, which is a absolutely hilarious but also poignant moment of the book, with Lara telling him, at first he can't believe it because she knows about Ketch and the lie of the Ewok, but as she tells Kolat, has been trained because they want to see if it's possible, they being Zinj's forces, for an Ewok to pilot and thus confirm or refute the Hawkbat's claim. Lara tells Kolat, we're both lies that became the truth. And so she has Tonan go off with the aliens in their shuttlecraft. Well, yes, it looks like that. Lara herself is flying out to help the Wraiths in her X-Wing, knowing even if she meets them, they're not going to take her back, and she will most likely die. She also barely survives thanks to the aliens surprising the Zinj lackey from before and Melvar, who was holding her at blaster point. But she stops the aliens from killing Melvar because he needs to live to be around for courtship of Princess Leia.
Should have killed him. That book is terrible.
So, the next chapter of Selagus, if you please.
So then we move into the final phase of Selagus. The Wraiths and Rogues pursue the 181st onto one of the planets in the Selagus system. I think it's a moon of a gas giant. And the 181st starts strafing the ruins that Iron Fist had destroyed 5 months before. And so Wedge thinks that they're attacking because there might be survivors, but instead it turns out that it's a trap. He shoots down Baron Fell, but it turns out that it's actually Tetran Kohl. Now, Kohl survives and starts crawling away because his leg is broken. And it reveals that Zinj created a fake 181st because everyone knew that Wedge was very sad about Baron Fell defecting from the New Republic. Although we find out in a book that we will be doing for the podcast later what really happened with that. Lara saves both Wedge and Tycho by blowing up some of the new TIE Raptors that are sort of like an X-Wing TIE in that they take the solar panels and instead of having them be like an H, they're X. They're like attached in X angles. And I think they have laser cannons on the ends of them, but I'm not 100% sure on that. They also have concussion missile launchers. Now, Lara blows up one of them, and Wedge blows up the other ones, but not before one of them launches a concussion missile that starts breaking Lara's ship apart. Wedge doesn't see what happens next, but after he blows up all the ties, he flies over Lara's X-Wing and shakes his head in the water because it's a sea battle.
Yeah.
Piggy and Corrin realize that the 181st is actually half human pilots and half droid pilots that have huge bombs inside them instead of pilots. And it's really kind of cool because if you go back to the Graven 7 mission where Talon Squadron is destroyed and Min destroys one of the TIE interceptors, it has a really huge explosion. So you can tell that Allston intended this always to be a half human, half droid bomb unit. So it's really cool going back and looking at how the 181st has always had these unusually big explosions for half of the ships that are blown up. So using jamming to defeat the computer coordination from the Iron Fist, they're able to destroy all of the 181st, and then they destroy the TIE Raptors, which follow. However, Iron Fist is able to get distance between her and the Mon Ramonda in the asteroid field. She enters the second death night cloak technology, which isn't a full cloak, but seems to be a semi-cloak that creates blackness and sensor defeating, but it doesn't create the illusion of nothing there. You just can't tell what is there. The Iron Fist goes to hyperspace, and the second death blows up. And part of the ship has been painted with the Iron Fist name, so they believe when they see the Super Star Destroyer wreckage exploding that the starfighters were finally able to hit the reactor of the Super Star Destroyer and get it to explode. All of the Iron Fist's TIE fighters and most of Nova and Polearm Squadron who were attacking the Iron Fist at the time got totally wrecked by the explosion of the second death.
We even see the point of view of one of the A-Wing pilots having recognized that this pre-assembled bit of wreckage is an imitation of the Iron Fist, and he tries to fly out of there to warn Mon Ramonda, but he is, for once, too slow, even in his A-Wing.
Yeah. It's really interesting how Allston spends a significant amount of time showing the perspective of the victims of war. Even though a lot of them are the villains on Zinja's side, he often shows their perspectives as the race destroy them, which is very interesting. And in this case, he shows an A-Wing destroyed by the explosion of the second death. Han believes that he's won. Zinj calls to swear at him. Zinj calls to swear at him in 60 alien languages, and Han says the infamous "kiss my Wookiee" line. In this case, he actually says, "Well, I guess you could kiss my Wookiee."
And that takes us to the conclusion where it's revealed Edna Gast was actually still alive, and they've just been faking her death. Actually, I think that came up in an earlier chapter.
It did, briefly, but I forgot to include it.
Yeah. So we see Nawara ask her several times about how she wants her 500,000 credits she's being paid for working with the New Republic to be in Imperial currency, not New Republic currency, and that she wants to go to Coruscant. But then when she is going through customs and presents her identification that, yeah, I'm authorized to have this much money, the customs official says, well, yes, but having Imperial currency instead is suspect and criminal on some level. And then Nawara corrects that it's actually an even worse crime, sedition. And I think she could get a death sentence. Or not a death sentence, life sentence. So if she gets arrested and spits at Nawara, who just shrugs it off. And that's the last we ever see of her, because Gast had also been very speciest, which makes sense given her work, but this could be something we talk about later. She's kind of an interesting foil to Lara. Mm-hmm. Well, specifically Gara, even. Meanwhile, back on Mon Ramonda, Face is promoted to captain officially, not just provisionally. The Wraiths, however, get decommissioned as a fighter squadron and converted into an intelligence unit, which most of them go along with, but Wes is very publicly saying he's going back to the Rogues, and Min does the same as well. Min says he wants to go to a starfighter squadron in general rather than being a pilot. And then Wedge tells him, actually, you're going to Rogue Squadron, which will be picked up in Isard's Revenge. Meanwhile, Lara, having aboard Iron Fist, asked Tonin to refer to her by the old practice identity of Kearney Slane, Coruscant Hauto owner's daughter, from when she was training, is revealed to have survived, got back to Corellia. Back is more characteristic of the false identity she has, and is sending Min a message as Kearney Slane, which gets picked up by Han and Wedge due to a filter for any transmissions from Laranazzo, in which in the message, Kearney is reaching out to Min, wanting to meet again. Han tells the communications officer to send the message on to Min, then erase any trace of it. And if that's not clear, I'll have Chewie go explain it to you. So then we get Wedge and Han right as their fleet is about to return to Coruscant, and that sets up courtship with Princess Leia, because they're about to run into the Hapen fleet, as I understand it.
Correct. And there's a really funny line about how Wedge's Commander Square quarters himself, lying by omission, because Wedge knew that Lara had punched out because he saw her cockpit.
Yes. I mean, the first interaction in this between Wedge and Han is Wedge convincing Han that no gambling is permitted on base.
And General Preston refuses to have women on base.
So we know he's good at deception, despite what Han may think.
Well, and he pulled that whole deception on West this book.
Yes.
So that's the end of Solo Command, and it's a journey. It's an intense journey. A couple of fun observations before we start. Now, this was something both Wraith and I thought. So, Wraith, go ahead.
So, if you've seen the trailer for the upcoming Marvel movie Thunderbolts with an asterisk, there's a scene shown in that where the group of not quite heroes fall into an incinerator and have to fight their way out, and it was very reminiscent of Sapphire. And it's also hilarious. Or do you want to say this one?
No, you're the one who noticed this one.
The incinerator is not hilarious, to be clear. The hilarious thing is that the actor who played Bob in the Top Gun sequel, Lewis Pullman, is in Thunderbolts and identifies himself yet again as Bob.
And I think it's funny because anyone who loves Solo Command, as soon as the heat lights turned on in the incinerator in that scene, was like, dang it, that's Sapphire. It's so set up the same way that Solo Command sets up that scene, and we're just like,
I hope they have explosives.
I hope they've got some bombs too. Now, if you're subscribed to our Substack, where we post the episodes first, at the beginning of the month, I posted what I did when I was listening to Solo Command, which was build my brother's Lego Millennium Falcon while I was listening to the Solo Command audiobook. And I put a bunch of Easter eggs on the picture. Well, 3 pictures. One of them is, if you look in the cockpit, you'll see that Chewie and what's actually C-3PO, but I said it was Squeaky, are flying the Falcon. You have 2 interceptors who are appearing as Lara and the fake Baron Fell flying over the Falcon. You have an A-wing docked to one of the escape pod sides, and that's Dorset Canair. And I also posted a picture in the gunnery turret. You had Wedge Antilles, and I had Wedge's helmet on the Rebel pilot figure. So if you know Wedge's helmet you will figure out that it is, in fact, Wedge and not Luke or some random rebel pilot. I also have the Action Fleet Sentinel class landing craft, which has folding wings and an expanding laser turret. And I also got a little Ewok figure from the Action Fleet battle packs and a rebel pilot representing Lara. So I bought this all because of Solo Command, because Lara is just awesome. And the fact that we finally get a real Ewok pilot after 3 books of stuffed Ewok pilots is just too good. Now, as we're talking about our main characters, both heroes and villains, I hope we can get into why we love them and admire them and find them inspirational, or why we find them villainous. Because I think there's a lot of interesting philosophical and moral layers that Allston builds into these characters. So, of course, let's start with Han Solo, because he's the title character of Solo Command.
Yeah, so he gets a lot of depth as a fleet commander, and it also kind of sets up how he's not frequently in that role in subsequent books, because it's very stressful and he's got all these lives in his hands.
I love a line early in the book where he says he wishes he could be in the Falcon. All he could do is give orders and hope his orders were good, that fewer of his people died, and there's never good enough that none of his people died. And I thought that was so... That's what you want from a fleet commander, is that they don't want their people to die, but they're willing to do it, but they have regret. So it's that fine balance that you need in a good commander.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also a bit of... It takes me a minute to remember what I was going to say. Lara kind of psychoanalyzing to Zinj, and this is lies, why Han is doing what he's doing, in terms of the worlds he's headed to attack Zinj at are based on ones that Leia would recognize, and he's motivated by appealing to her and keeping her interest in him as a rebel general rather than just a smuggler. Of course, that's not the case, but we do see some hints of Han wondering why Leia is with him and all of that, which I suppose is setting up the issues to come in Courtship of Princess Leia, just from what little I know of it. Well, I know the basic plot premise. I just haven't read it myself.
I love the scene just before the mutiny where Wedge and Han are talking, and Han has these moments of self-doubt. And Wedge wants to have Chewie beat some sense into him, because Wedge can see why Leia loves Han, but Han has so much self-doubt. And I think that's realistic, because Han comes from such a different background. I mean, he was a poor kid on the streets, and Leia, of course, was a princess. But Leia sees the nobility that we see in Han throughout these books, and she honors that and loves them. So I really like Han. I think Allston's voice for Han isn't always as recognizable as Troy Denning or Tim Zahn. I think Tim Zahn and Denning have maybe a better voice from the movie version of Han, but this Han is still consistent with the values and characteristics that we see in the rest of Star Wars. And it's a great look at Han from a different perspective than we often see. It's definitely better than when we see Han as a fleet general in the Black Fleet Crisis, which I think is the only other time we see Han as a fleet general in the expanded universe. So if you want to see Han in a command role, Solo Command, as the title says, is where to go. I don't really like him in Black Fleet Crisis, but I don't really like anyone in Black Fleet Crisis.
There's also the element that since he's in command of the whole fleet, Han can't really talk to anyone else about this because there's no one on his rank level, and technically Wedge is subordinate too, but they go back long enough that it doesn't matter.
Now, of course, our second main heroic character is Wedge Antilles. He doesn't really have an arc, but he does have some really intense emotional goals in his pursuit of Baron Fell. He gets the amazing practical joke on West scene, and like the first novel, Wraith Squadron, he plays some incredibly brutal therapist moments. In the first book, it's with Kel, where he just gives Kel some tough love to get him in a place where he can work with Wes Jansen and figure out what's wrong with him. Here he does the same thing with Min. You see the level of care he has for his pilots, and I really appreciate Wedge. He's because you get more time with him in the Wraith books than with Han. I feel closer to Wedge, and I just really love how he's a father to the Wraiths and to the Rogues, and he's so passionate about getting as many of his people through the missions alive as possible.
Yeah. There's also a moment at the beginning of the book where we get to see Wedge dispose of Wes and Hobby trying to needle him about how it looks like he's going on a date with someone by going into the elevator with them and then tricking them through old parade ground muscle memory to turning and facing into the elevator wall and then quickly stepping back out, and the elevator closes and sends them off on their merry way while he fetches a new one to leave alone to go see someone, not officially confirmed who in the book, but on Aaron Allston's website, he said it was in fact Ayala, as Wes and Hobby suspected.
Now we get to the two characters that I would argue are the actual main characters of Solo Command. And the first one, of course, is Lara Notzal, also called Garapetithel, and at the end, Kearney Slane. Lara is one of my favorite characters in all of Star Wars. I just love her moral arc, going from being a really brainwashed Imperial intelligence officer. You just see the level of deception she's been fed and the self-deception she has and all the missing chunks in her mind that she finds out about when she starts realizing that what she's been told is a lie. She just finds big chunks of her memory gone. And so her journey to become someone who's fighting for things she believes are good rather than the Empire is really powerful. And I just love it. I find her line to Kolat at the end of the book where she says, "We're the same, you and I. We're both lies that eventually became the truth," to be both hilarious and intensely moving, because she started out calling herself Lara Notzal because it was a fake identity that she'd used, and she saw the opportunity to betray the New Republic. And in the end, she wanted more than anything to be Lara Notzal so she could be a friend and be an ally to the Wraiths. And of course, Ketch started as a joke from Wes Jansen, inspired by Piggy, and it inspired Face to tell Zinj about a pilot, and then inspired Zinj to see if he could actually do it.
Yeah, and the scene where Lara is exposed is incredibly well written. It's just reading it, even the first time, it felt like something I could see happening in a movie. Where you've got the external X-Wing action and everything going on in the cockpit with him physically reacting just would be great. Another thing that really stood out about Lara kind of the second time I was reading it. So I first read these, I don't know, when I was 10 or 11, kind of the second period in which I was reading it. And then a few years later, so I'd wanted to be, growing up, a pilot like my whole life. And some medical stuff happened where that wasn't an option anymore. And so Lara's line about how she never get to fly with the Wraiths after being exposed really stood out to me in terms of how she goes and finds her own path after that anyway. And of course, she does find a way to fly with the Wraiths again one last time in her X-Wing to save the day. So, because
And then she makes her life about flying in her shuttle business.
I don't like the general plot line for the most part of, you know, so-and-so is medically DQ'd, like, say, it works well enough with Nomura after Back to War. But say a certain canon novel that had something like that with Wedge, I don't care for it too much.
So, that novel was terrible anyway.
But yeah, we see Lara get to save the day, and it's also really interesting how we don't usually have the usual arc of so-and-so's redeemed and they get to be one of the good guys again. Lara knows even if she does all these things, the Wraiths are probably never going to accept her back, so she has to do them because they're the right thing to do, not for what she's getting out of it. And she knows if she goes back to Selagus instead of leaving with Tonin and Kolat and the other aliens, she's most likely going to die. But she does it anyway. And imagine what would happen in the galaxy in terms of Star Wars Legends if Wedge and Tycho had both died that day because she didn't come back. Because they would have. A lot of
bad stuff.
Tycho was bailed out and under parachute, essentially, about to get strafed. And then Wedge was on the ground confronting who he thought was Fel, too far from his X-Wing to get back. And if Lara hadn't showed up and shot down one of the Raptors, chased the other one off from its own strafing run. So,
yeah, I stand by my contention that Lara Notzel's journey is incredibly powerful. And recently we had some conversations on one of the Star Wars servers we're on where we kind of argued that Lara could be considered the main character of the Wraith Squadron Trilogy because she starts out as an Imperial, kind of in the background, but she does have point of view at the end of Wraith Squadron. And then her decision to truly join the New Republic is a key point in Iron Fist. And then, of course, her exposure and her plan to take down Zinj are incredibly crucial in Solo Command. Now, our second main character, in that he gets probably the next most point of view sections, is Min Donos. And he has an incredibly rocky journey in this, starting from trying to make better decisions and ask Lara to go out and plan for a future instead of devoting his whole life to revenge, like he's one of the commandos in like the movie Munich, just going off and killing all the people responsible for destroying Talon Squadron. So he's trying to plan for the future by asking Lara out, and then he finds out that Lara is Gara, and he snaps back to his complete vengeance-seeking state. But then he realizes he doesn't want to kill her anymore. And Wes helps him to see that he was always too afraid of losing control to live and have a future. And he fights his way back to Wedge's respect so that Wedge allows him to fly again. And then he proved himself, and Wedge assigns him to Rogue Squadron, and it's a really nice journey. It's not quite as powerful as Lara's, but I think that's not a knock on it because Lara's, I think, is really unusually powerful. But Min's is really good as a man fighting for his sanity and fighting for the respect that he himself loses. Like, he's the one who fires at Face, so he has to claw his way back.
And there's a scene in the final battle with Salagas where Min warns everybody, like, this is an ambush, and Wedge is thinking he's flashing back to Talon Squadron, but in fact he's still there and correct that Singe is about to start shooting at the asteroids, which is a tactic he'd done before, and Min trained on that simulation back when he was in flight school, so that saves a lot of lives too.
And last, of course, of the main characters, you get a lot of Face in this book. Face, of course, becomes the temporary and then in the end permanent captain of the Wraiths. And we see how he needs to mature as a leader, and he is helped a lot by Lara herself. He plans the Sapphire mission and leaves out a lot of details, and Lara helps him to see how to do that better. And we see him planning a lot better missions in going forward. We see him screwing up really badly with Lara and revealing the truth, and then he's able to keep things under control much better. So there's a lot of subtle maturity that Face gains through this book, and it's cool to see that the race will be in good hands, even though Wedge, of course, is going back to Rogue Squadron.
And we do later get to see Face in command of the Wraiths in the field alone in later material.
And it's great.
Yes.
Now we have one new squad member. So last in Iron Fist, we had 4 new squad members. This time we only have one to replace Ton Fanon. And it's a Lesser Targon, who's a Deveronian, and also a medical corpsman. So he's not just field trained, he's actually a real medic, but he's not a full doctor like Ton was. Kind of unusually, we don't get a backstory for him. But that's okay. I think there's enough character work. I think there's enough character work from the other Wraith pilots that we don't feel that we need it, and he adds his own goofy flavor of pretending to be the most important person in the universe and being super superstitious. But a Lesser, I would be surprised if he's many people's favorite character. I know he's got to be some people's favorite character because everyone's someone's favorite character, but there's just not as much to latch on to as even smaller characters like Grinder or Phelan or even Atrial Taban, I would say, has a bit more depth than a Lesser. But a Lesser is fun. I enjoy his scenes.
Yeah, there's a bit in the 3rd chapter, the one where they're all in the pilot's lounge, where Lasar suggests the Han Solo is running scared because of the intelligence the Wraiths are giving him, and then it's revealed Han Solo has been in a high-backed chair of sorts, hidden from view the entire time, and thus heard Lasar say that, and they're all on active alert duty, so Lasar can't even have enough drink to forget what he said. And thus Lasar starts begging various pilots to kill him. Which is, he just wants out of the shame, I guess. It's a bit bizarre, but in a funny way, with how over the top it is.
Now, these aren't main characters, but it's really fun to see them again. The rogues, we get a ton of fun stuff, like Gavin Darklighter being upset at babysitting, even though, as Wraith pointed out, he is the youngest of the pilots. We get some sad stuff. Of course, Taldira gets brainwashed and then is killed, even though he chooses to not fight, which is nice to see him able to fight past the brainwashing. We get some new rogues. Pedna Scotian, if you go on the archive.org webpage for Aaron Allston's website, you see some backstory for Pedna, but it's not really important. She doesn't really have much character in the series. Ran Kether, Target New, who's a Rhodian pilot. The mechanic for the rogues is Koyi Komad from the Phantom Affair, who was a hyperspace PhD student who decided to join the Rebel Alliance, well, the New Republic, in the campaign against Isard, and became the Rogue's chief mechanic. I think Stackpole kind of forgot about Zrai from the first Rogue Squadron novel, the Verpine mechanic, and just Koyi Komad just became the mechanic, which is cool because I think Koyi has more character because, of course, Phantom Affair and then her scenes in Blood and Honor. But it's kind of weird how Zrai just disappears.
Well, if they did need another Twi'lek to be taken off duty in terms of Allston and the writing, so that part made sense.
And it is kind of cool how it's clear that Allston read Koyi's appearances in Phantom Affair, how she talks about how she could have gone to the private sector. I mean, a grad student in hyperspace definitely could have gone to the private sector in research or technical development or shipbuilding and made tons more money than as a mechanic for the Rogues. So lots of cool character stuff. A bunch of Corran stuff. I mean, Corran being a Jedi is very important in the last sequence. And then Corran, unfortunately, has to kill Taldira and is able to warn Wedge about Taldira's brainwashing just a second early so he could dodge. Sorry, so he could dodge.
We also have, of course, several villains. We got the Warlord Zinj. And it amuses me reading the book again how he's introduced as the Warlord Zinj. We also have Malvar with the creepily metallic fingernails, and Nagast, who's an interesting foil to Gara in my mind, because her uncle was running the project, and so she got pulled into it through those family connections, but she embraced it rather than having second thoughts. She's also, as soon as she's captured, she immediately agrees to help the Wraiths, because, Zinj would kill me anyway. But then, once Namara's negotiating with her, she's very nasty. And then we have Gailey, who, unlike the brainwashed Twi'leks, is just a paid-off assassin, cafeteria worker on Mon Ramonda. Well, a cafeteria worker paid to be an assassin, not a full-time assassin posing as a cafeteria worker. He'd be much better at his job if he were a full-time assassin, but he's not. Then we have Velar, who's the captain of Iron Fist. He really only stood out for one passage toward the end that gives him some villainous nobility, where he's regretful as he calls in all of Iron Fist TIE fighters to help sell the illusion that Iron Fist was there and blew up by luring them to their deaths, which will occur.
But he still does it.
Second
he feels
death
bad about it.
He
still does it.
He does it. He feels bad, but he's doing his duty. Then we have Tetram Cole, who we've talked about, and get some details about just how well he was able to fly through Allston's website on the archive.
So I was actually thinking this all the way through this reading. I was just like, Baron Fell is ludicrously better than ever. He's good enough that Darth Vader wanted a better ship because he was tired of Baron Fell beating him in simulators. So he's really, really good. So how could just some dude be good enough? Well, Allston answered this question. He says that Tetran Cole and the rest of the bogus 181st were enjoying the benefits of computerized coordination from the Iron Fist, and in an earlier scene from the Reprisal, see Chapter 13. And this computer help allowed him to impersonate Fel well enough to fool even pilots who'd flown against him previously. Remember that most pilots who'd flown against Fel previously were dead, so the survivors tended to be pilots who'd seen him from a distance or had their starfighters crippled early in an engagement. Most pilots' knowledge of Fel's flying techniques comes from reviewing recordings, which isn't the same as facing him in person. Cole was also an excellent pilot, which helped the deception. Additionally, he won some matches through reputation. People would seize up at the thought of facing Fel and become easier prey. However, it's to be noted that until Solo Command, no one who'd previously flown against the real Fel flew against Cole, so they couldn't put his real lethality to the test.
And Wedge only flies against Cole the one time. At the end of Solo Command, they'd flown together briefly in Iron Fist when Wedge was posing as one of the Hawkbats, specifically Catch, but they don't. There's more they're flying next to each other, and then they break off and go into battle. I think they're not doing a whole lot of dogfighting side by side where they really get to see how each other are doing.
I like the fact that you have this varied cast of rogues working for Zinj, and what they all have in common is this selfishness. Whereas the Wraiths and the rogues and Han, they all have this very communitarian ethos. They're trying to think of each other. They're trying to protect each other. They're trying to make each other better. I mean, even Wedge is being at his most ruthless and talking to Donos brutally. His goal is to save Donos' career and save, to some extent, his life and his self-respect. Help him to build himself back up. You'd never see Zinj or Melvar do anything like that. I mean, there's a funny sequence, but it's also kind of chilling, where Zinj is throwing a temper tantrum and shooting up his office with a blaster pistol, and Zinj's guards poke their heads in and see Zinj isn't in danger, just Melvar, and they don't care about Melvar. Like there's no thought of them trying to keep Melvar safe. There's no thought of anyone trying to keep anyone safe in Zinj's organization. It's pure competition and selfishness. And I think that's is plausible. It's not kind of the ludicrous Tarkin, I'm going to rule by fear with a Death Star. Like it's like sometimes the villains in Star Wars can just be so megalomaniacal, it can be a little hard to believe that they're a functioning person. But you believe that Zinj and Melvar and Gast and Gailey and Velar and Tetran Cole, they're all people with personalities and motivations you can understand, but they just given in to that selfishness, pure selfishness. I think that's very plausible. It allows them to be competent. A lot of people have drawn connections to the show Andor, which allows the Imperials to be competent, but they're also pure selfishness. They're all pure self-interest and just what can I get out of this?
Yeah, and on the reverse to that, with the Battle of Selagus, we see the 181st getting sent off to fire into the destroyed settlements, and it makes no sense tactically, and Wedge knows it's a trap, and yet still he goes in because there just might be people alive still down there.
And the New Republic doesn't exist to protect itself. It exists to protect the people who need protection.
Yeah. If it had been written, if we'd seen Gavin's point of view during that, it could have been interesting to see him thinking about the Halonet, was it?
Halonet.
And
flashbacks to that would be devastating, and he'd be like, no, let's kill these guys. We have a lot of naval fleet. We have a lot of naval fleet battles in this book, which is a big difference. We had some fleet battles, but they're mostly seen from starfighter perspective in Iron Fist, and to some extent in Wraith Squadron. Um, but the Lusancia battle is really fighters and freighters mostly against the Lusancia. This is full on, like dozens of capital ship level battles, and we see that it is all from the perspective of Iron Fist and Mon Ramada. Allston doesn't try and confuse us too much by jumping to say Serpent Smile or Agonizer. Sorry, not Agonizer. That's a later book. Um, or
Red Gauntlet.
Red Gauntlet, or even like Mondalindo or Mon Caron or any of the Rebel Star Destroyers. He keeps it focused on the flagships, but you still get the real sense of cooperation and coordination and the complexity of these fleet battles. Oftentimes, we have to remember that these fleet battles are happening in minutes and sometimes even seconds because the devastation of a turbo laser blast is so powerful. But of course, when you're writing it, it takes a lot longer, and reading it in an audiobook takes a lot longer. But I think Allston really captures the devastation and power and the joy, the dark joy of a naval fleet battle in Star Wars. I think it's really cool. How do you like the addition of naval in addition to starfighter fleet battles?
It's very well done. I mean, we get all of the different classes. It's not just the big battleships that carry starfighters duking it out. You have, smaller ships like Lancer frigates or CR-90s. At one point, it's mentioned that the former Nightcaller is now renamed and part of the fleet, though that's the only time it comes up.
I was a little bummed that you never
Yeah.
get Wedge thinking, "Oh, it's the Nightcaller. I should say hi to Captain Taban."
Yeah, it was also amusing. So we get the interdictor cruiser that Han has to borrow borrow against Singe from the Empire, because I guess the one that's seen at the end of Wedge's gamble working for the New Republic must have been elsewhere. But yeah, that bit with the interdictor commanded by Roberus, if we want to talk about him, essentially using its own gravity wells to push against an oncoming Star Destroyer and thus stay in the fight just a little bit longer so Zinj can't flee. Was some good tactical ideas Austin had.
Now, one of those tactical ideas I wanted to have a little discussion with you on the pod here. The Millennium Falsehood is, of course, a big part of the book, and it's on the cover. But do you feel that the falsehood plays an essential part, or is it just kind of a fun bonus? Like, how do you view the falsehood's part of the plot?
So, and for those who, missed this part, the actual Falcon has been aboard Leia's flagship the whole time. So they need the falsehood for that reason, and because they're doing stuff with it that the Falcon would never do, like potentially drop a giant bomb and be expendable. I mean, the plot could have existed. The events of the novel could have existed without it. It's a way that doesn't really get brought up of confirming that Lara Notzel is still loyal to the Wraiths, because she knows it's fake and she never tells Zinj that, and they can tell he's never acting accordingly. In fact, she even addresses the falsehood as the Falcon in her comm broadcast at Comkin 5, overheard by Fel. So we don't really see the New Republic putting 2 and 2 together, that she's still calling it the Falcon. And thus, that's a sign of her loyalty as well. Of course, I like the falsehood because we get to see the A-Wing blasting off it, going 1v24 against TIE interceptors. But yeah, I think it's definitely an important and a good long-running juxtaposition to Second Death, which doesn't become fully relevant until the end of the novel. So the falsehood as the fake ship runs with it for like the middle of the novel, and then Second Death picks up that mantle afterward.
And I think it's really clever how Allston constructs the conclusion of Solo Command, because it depends so much on Lara, whose story goes back to the beginning of Wraith Squadron. The 181st, which also goes back to the beginning of Wraith Squadron, depends on the Razor's Kiss, which is in the Iron Fist. So like it's a very good like trilogy finale, tying together these different plot threads and events in one big double battle of Vahaba and Salagas. Now, we open the novel with the brainwashing plot, which I thought, especially in the audiobook, had real horror elements, just being trapped in the brainwashing and being unable to figure out why you're doing it or what even you're doing, and watching the Twi'leks and the Gotels and the Celestins commit acts of horrible terror that aren't their fault. Like it's pretty scary, and the racial tensions that Allston develops through that, in my opinion, feel more real because we see their effects on Dia and Kogi than we do in the Krytos trap, because there's no real person who expresses those racial tensions in Krytos trap.
Yeah.
Or maybe I should say the only person who seems to do it is Boris Kvalia, and we know he's always just playing things for his own selfish gain.
And the person we see like inside their mind as they're brainwashed the most is Taldira, and he's an existing character. Something I forgot until just now about the falsehood is retroactively it makes the bit in Heir to the Empire when Han and also Wedge are surprised by the fake YT-1300 Falcon that Thrawn has that's flying in to pick them up. But then Leia's like, something's wrong, senses it in the Force, and Han realizes it doesn't have the underside blaster. And they're like, Thrawn's found a YT-1300 Falcon. How could he have pulled this off? When less than a year before, or 18 months before, Wedge and Han were running around with their own fake YT-1300 Falcon. Is funny in hindsight. Kind of doesn't work as well anymore, but it amuses me.
It's funny. Now, something I realized when I was rereading for the podcast, Salagas is a capital ship chase that depends on speeds. It doesn't depend on running out of gas, but it does depend on fixing the hyperdrive. And so I'm thinking this is the Mon Calamari cruiser versus Super Star Destroyer battle that Last Jedi should have been.
Or if you focus on the voice, it's kind of like Wrath of Khan with fighting in the Nebula, and you got the Scotty Simon guy. If you're familiar with that movie, so in that, if I remember right, it's been a long time since I've seen it. Kirk knows Khan is listening in, or no, Spock knows Spock knows Khan is listening in, so he gives a coded message referring to how many hours it's going to take, but really it's minutes to repair. So that part sort of works. And you've got the two guys who are in at the death against each other as personal rivals. Because it's mentioned at Salagas that Iron Fist might even try to hide out inside the upper levels of the gas giant. And man, I really want to see all of that in like some live action-esque or video game type of format.
I think the YouTube channel Corey Loses has done some renderings of some of the Zinj campaign. I can't remember how much of Selagus they did, but it was a decent chunk. So I would check that out.
I've obviously seen their full art base run stuff.
Now, the reason we did Solo Command now instead of back when we started the podcast with Wraith Squadron is because the audiobook read by Mark Thompson came out at the beginning of November. So both of us were able to listen to it. And so let's give a little review of it. What'd you think of this new audiobook of Solo Command?
Very moving. The audiobook, especially the Thompson ones, do a really good job with kind of the emotional parts. Thinking of one at the end of Vision of the Future in particular that I won't specify until we get to that. But yeah, that's really good. And he's very versatile with his voices. Wow, I don't know that anyone could be a convincing Wookiee sound as a human actor. That part was rough.
They make some interesting choices. So normally when they have a Wookiee talking, they go back to Ben Burtt's sound library and use the combination of bear, walrus, all the different animals that they use to make Chewie's speech. And they actually do that in some of the scenes here. But in some of the scenes, they had Mark Thompson do some fake Wookiee sounds, which Thompson does as good as I think a human could do.
Yeah.
But it's not the same as, taking bear noises and actually putting them as a Wookiee. So I'm not sure why they chose to do that. Maybe they wanted a specific vibe from the Wookiee noises that they couldn't find a sound for, but it wasn't quite as strong as when they just used the sounds from the movies for Wookiees. I did get to meet Thompson in person at Comic-Con in Minneapolis this month, and he was very nice, and he said he had a great time reading the X-Wing books, and he thought that Kratos Trap in particular really stuck out to him because, of course, the whole COVID thing and the Kratos virus felt very weirdly predictive to him, and I thought that was quite reasonable. We did also, because it was an Essential Legends release, get a new cover. So our old cover, and as always, I publish the podcast with the old cover first, and then the new Essential Legends cover on the bottom of the post. The old cover by the series artist Paul Ewell is the Compkin. Is it Compkin or Kidriff? I think it's Compkin, right?
It's Kidriff because Compkin had the A-Wing. It should have been Compkin.
Right, you're right. So we know it's the Kidriff mission because Tycho's there. And so we get a vision of the Kidriff city with all these kind of funny Sydney Opera House style shell-like roofs. And then the falsehood, which is not the Falcon, but the people who just look at the cover probably think it's the Falcon, which is the point. And then Tycho's X-Wing, which is weird because they look like they're the same size, but that's because the X-Wing's much closer to us than the Falcon. Very cool cover. Really gives you that sense of Han Solo, like Han Solo in command with the Falcon. So I think that's a good choice to put the falsehood on the cover. The new cover features Shala and Runt. And I think Runt actually makes some sense because, he's got that great scene fighting the Netbers. Like that's terrifying. Like you just imagine this horseman grabbing a dude and slamming into the walls. Like he's just so angry because he got burned. Shala really doesn't do that much in this book. So I kind of wish they'd picked Lara and they put Shala. I think Shala would have made more sense in Iron Fist because she does a lot more in that book. But it's a cool cover. You get a picture of the falsehood in like silhouette along with several X-Wings to kind of give that starship flavor. It's a cool cover, and it has that yellow, pale orange, red sort of shade that the Wraith Squadron books have been in. How do you feel about the two covers?
Yeah, I mean, I like the old covers more generally, just because I'm used to them. The new cover, I would have rather had Min and Lara, even though that breaks with the alien theme. You could have also, if you really wanted it to be like one human, one alien, one male, one female, it could have been Vort and Lara for this one, because Vort has a lot to do.
Mm-hmm. Piggy does a lot of good stuff in this book. It is weird to me why Piggy was on Iron Fist. Like,
Yeah.
Piggy would have made more sense. Honestly, Piggy would have made more sense on this one, and Runt would have made more sense on Iron Fist because Runt has the ball in Iron Fist.
Yeah, put Runt and Shala on Iron Fist, Vort and Lara on Solo Command, and you can do Kel and Ibtisam on Wraith Squadron for very poignant reasons.
Mm-hmm. Oh, man. Oh, that hits me right there because of that scene where he tries to save her. It's so good. Now, the question, we've kind of answered this, but many people ask, should one read The Courtship of Princess Leia after Solo Command? And my answer is absolutely not, because I did read Courtship of Princess Leia, and I was very disappointed. And Wraith's answer is?
I have not read Courtship of Princess Leia myself, so it's hard to say, do something I've not done in going
But the
on
fact that you haven't
20 odd years of reading Star Wars books, I've never bothered to do it. So, I mean if
that's
you really want,
your opinion is you don't need to.
I'm also not as much of like a romance book reader, even as much as you are. So,
well, I'm a big romance novel reader. I read a bunch of romance novels, and the thing about Courtship is it's a bad romance novel. Like it's not good romance. It's just not. It's very frustrating if you like romance because the characters are so bad you don't want them to get together. So I just pretend it happened in a different way that doesn't involve anything stupid.
It could make sense as a holodrama in universe.
People do say it's like a Bollywood movie. I've only watched one Bollywood movie, and that's Bride and Prejudice, the Bollywood adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, and it was okay, but I don't see a similarity from that movie, the one movie I've seen like that, and Courtship. So I don't get that.
Well, there is a novel, I won't say which one, that canonically is a holodrama in universe. So,
Courtship, yeah, but that book sucks. We had one we had one thread that was kind of running through the whole series, which is Wedge's bet with Akbar that Akbar will judge the Wraiths are a successful experiment, or if he thinks they're not successful, Wedge has to become a general. And we get references to this, of course, at the beginning where they set it up, and then the end of the first novel. Do we have a reference to it in Iron Fist? I don't remember one.
I don't think so.
And then at the very end of Solo Command, Wedge says that Akbar sent him a message that he was rooting for Wraith Squadron, so obviously Wraith Squadron was successful. I think that's a little unsatisfying because of the setup. Like, that's a very intense scene where Wedge really doesn't want to become a general, and Akbar, holds him over a barrel to make him do it so he can form Wraith Squadron, and then it just kind of happens off screen. But that was kind of a mechanical thing. It wasn't really part of Wedge's arc. So I don't mind. That's definitely not one of the more satisfying parts of Solo Command for me. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, by that point, we've seen and got to know so many other people beyond just Wedge, since him and Wes are the only returning characters in Wraith Squadron, so to speak. There aren't new ones. The question of that and will he become a general is kind of less important because we're focused on all these other people. Plus, we know from the Thrawn trilogy he's a commander still at that point. But then Stackpole will take up the question of Wedge's rank
Well, actually,
in
so the
Isard's
Dark
Revenge.
Empire source book
Yes.
has a scene where Wedge gets promoted, but that gets retconned by Isard's Revenge, which we will read in January.
Schedules permitting.
But Dark Empire had Wedge as a general commanding a Star Destroyer at the beginning of the comic, and it sucked, and it was terrible. And then Kevin J. Anderson had Wedge being a general, and also for some reason a bodyguard in the Jedi Academy trilogy. And I actually didn't read any of that part because I've only read the first book. But then he also had Wedge be a general in Darksaber, which I haven't read in 20 years, so I don't really remember. But then, of course, you get Wedge as a general. Then, of course, you get Wedge as a general in New Rebellion, which is slightly better. And we'll talk about that a bit, I think, in several episodes. There's an episode that we have planned that kind of wraps up what we call the first season of X-Wing. We have lots of thoughts about how Wedge is handled in non-X-Wing books that I think we'll be able to say. But Allston was definitely thinking through. He knows Wedge is going to become a general, and he wants to show what Wedge's thoughts and feelings are about command and what he's like as a commander. And he shows him commanding one squadron in this book and then commanding, 4 squadrons. And technically he's commanding the entire starfighter complement, and we're seeing him handle bigger responsibilities in this book. So that's cool because we see he is a great commander.
I think, strictly speaking, in the Thrawn trilogy, Wedge is identified as wing commander.
Yes, that is correct. I was about to mention that. I was like,
he commands a whole wing in theory, although like X-Wing and a lot of other novels didn't really run with wing commander as a separate rank.
Yeah, I think it was Zahn that had because Wedge was I think he was a captain in Return of the Jedi, and he's a captain in the comics. And so I think Zahn is the one who called Wedge a commander, and so Stackpole had to figure out how to make him a commander, and they just kind of went with that rank. But nobody else is a commander. Like nobody in the entire Star Wars universe is a commander.
Because there's in the Thrawn trilogy they talk about, I forget his name.
Commander Varth?
Yeah, Wing Commander Varth.
But that's the only other one. And he's dead.
Yeah, he's mentioned in Back to War as like being the guy above Pash Kraken for his wing.
I don't know. It's funny seeing how the various pieces of the New Republic military kind of fell into place through various books. Actually, I should check and see if there's any commanders in Black Fleet Crisis, but I won't because I'm not going to read those books again. So I read this book in 1999. You read this book probably in the early 2000s, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, if you read it in the early 2000s, you already knew that Isard's Revenge and Starfighters of Adumar were coming. But I wouldn't have. But when you finished the Wraith Squadron trilogy, what were your feelings? Did you have feelings about, oh, this is the end of the X-Wing series? Or did you feel like it needed to have more books? Like, how did you feel?
I mean, I definitely liked the Wraith ones best from what I remember. And this is me like remembering stuff from over 20 years ago to when I was 10 or so. Yeah, I mean, it definitely works as an ending on its own.
I agree. I think it's funny, even though I would have only had like 1 month, because I got it from the library. So it probably was about a month before I got the book, but it was another month before Isard's Revenge came out. And I would have thought, this is the end. And it's very satisfying. Like I thought we had the Rogue books and the Wraith books. And I was kind of like, kind of wish we had 4 Wraith books because I liked them better, like you did. Like I loved the Rogue books, but like I just fell in love with Kel and Face and Lara and Min. Just like those main character arcs were just so powerful to me. And I like Corin okay, but I just love those main characters in the race. So another book with the race, another book with the race would have been Gravy, sort of like Back to War was.
Yeah, I'm thinking of another like non-Star Wars book. There's 3 books specifically in terms of the novels. You know what I'm talking about, where it ends and it's such a definitive ending that I don't know that I want more in the series. And from what I know, more is not going to happen anyway, especially since this is going on close to 15 years old book series.
Is this one of the Wing books, or is it?
No, this is QNC.
Oh, okay. But of course, we did get more books. We got Isard's Revenge 2 months later, and Starfighter Dumar about 5 months after that. And 12 years after that, we got Mercy Kill. Actually, I think it might have been 13 years, but a good chunk, over a decade. But in my opinion, we actually got 7 more X-Wing books in the Michael Stackpole and Aaron Allston entries in the New Jedi Order and in the New Jedi Order and Legacy of the Force. So let's go through our ranking of the 7 X-Wing books.
I gotta go Solo Command number 1.
Well, let's start at the bottom. What would our least favorite be?
Kratos Trap.
Yeah, I'm still
Kratos
Trap at number 7.
It's gonna be KT.
And I do appreciate Kratos Trap a lot more this time through. Doing it for the podcast did show me a lot of the craft that Stackpole put in it. I still think he bit off more than he could chew in the space of the novel he had. And so I just think parts of it that I wanted to see more of and would have made it more satisfying are kind of underbaked. So Kratos Trap at number 7. What's number 6 for you?
Rogue Squadron.
Okay. I think I'd say Wedge's Gamble for me. I think that book is very fun, but it also makes no sense. So I still think it's number 6 for me. What about number 5?
It's gonna be Wedge's Gamble.
Okay. I am struggling. I think I'm going to put Rogue Squadron at number 5. I really like Rogue Squadron. It's my second favorite of the first 4. But as you can tell, both of us really like the Allston books.
Yep.
So number 4.
Back to War.
So for me, I'm actually going to put Wraith Squadron. I do love the book. But I think that you can kind of tell that Allston had no time to write it because there's a lot of plots that aren't quite as tightly woven together. I mean, if you look at Iron Fist and Solo Command, they're just tightly woven, just brilliant plotting and character arcs. Wraith Squadron's a bit baggy, and I appreciate that you can spend the time with the characters, but some of the character journeys don't feel as necessary as some of the journeys in Back to War, which I'm going to put next. So at number 3, what do you put?
Wraith Squadron.
Okay, and I put Back to War because that is my favorite of the Rogue books, and I think it is really good. I had such a good time rereading it for the pod last month. Number 2.
Iron Fist, no surprise.
Iron Fist as well. Just such a great book. Although a lot of fans put Iron Fist as their number 1 because of that Ton Fanon scene. And I
Yeah.
do love the Ton Fanon scene, but I gotta say the Lara scenes are better for me, and that's why number one for you.
The King of the
The
Droids,
King.
the only book with the King of the Droids still looking in. And
Correct.
on the audiobook front, Thompson's voice for Tonin is really good. It's like
Oh, man.
almost childlike.
He's able in that last scene with Lara, he's able to keep it believably a robot, but also put that emotion there. It's just brilliant. Thompson
Yes.
is so good. Yeah, Solo Command is my number one of the first 7 for sure. And sometimes it's my favorite Star Wars book. There are 2 other Star Wars books that sometimes take its place, and that's Vision of the Future and Starfighters of Adumar. But sometimes I'm just feeling that Solo Command, that finale of the trilogy, is so satisfying that it's top for me. All right, let's get in to our wing book section. This is the section. This is the section of the pod where we talk about books that if you liked the book that we read this month, you would probably like these other books. So, Wraith, what is your wing book?
So, and I'm stretching the definition of book.
We've done movies before.
Yeah, but I picked the movie Allied from, I think, 2016, which has a Canadian, and this is set during World War II. There's a Canadian Air Force intelligence officer helping a French resistance woman on a mission in Casablanca, and they fall in love during and after that. But then his superior suspects she may actually be a German spy who would have taken the real woman's identity after she was killed in order to him to help find the truth. And if she is a spy, kill her to prove his own innocence. So you can see the similarities to the Min and Lara plotline pretty well for Solo Command.
And this is the movie starring Brad Pitt and Marion Cotillard.
Yes.
My recommendation.
Don't go in expecting a very happy ending. I'll just say that.
My recommendation is actually 2 books, but they're technically happening at the same time. It's Ender's Game and Ender's Shadow. You get so most of the race are very young. I mean, Phelan was 19. Most of the other race aren't much older. But of course, Ender's Game is about 6 to 12-year-olds. But of course, Ender's Game is about 6 to 12-year-olds. But the reason I recommend it here is because you have huge scale fleet combat, a focus on the commanders and what it means to be an ethical commander. And so if you like that kind of big picture view of space combat in Solo Command with Han and Wedge, I think you'd like Ender and Bean.
The movie was probably panned, I think, but it also had Harrison Ford as the guy in charge.
I think the movie is not good.
Yeah, I figured it.
But I love the book. So I've heard people who watched the movie first and then read the book who really like the movie. And I think that's good. If it gets people to read the book, that's what I want from a movie. I just wish I liked it more.
Yeah. I just couldn't pass up mentioning his
Harrison Ford
involvement.
Was really good as Colonel Graff. The movie is not bad because of Harrison Ford. I definitely want to point that out. Now, next episode will be in January. We're going to be taking a month off for Christmas because Christmas is too busy. So tune in January when we will be reading Isard's Revenge, which is book 8 of the X-Wing series by Michael Stackpole. It's a return to Rogue Squadron after Solo Command, so we get to see some of the impact of Solo Command on the X-Wing series. And it has connections galore to novels and comics and so many things. The context section is going to be bonkers. It's going to be everywhere. So tune in next time when we cover Isard's Revenge. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening, and keep your books locked in reading position.